I'm Sam, and I'm not a physicist, and I'm here with Eric, who is a physicist and has also done a lot of scientific work in biology. And we're continuing our discussion of the scientific method in biology and other sciences that are not physics. So, Eric, take us away.
Yeah, hi Sam. Yeah, so we're going to talk about something which is sometimes called pea-hacking, which isn't what it sounds like. It doesn't have anything to do with urine. The letter P is reserved in most parts of science to refer to probability. And Sam, do you happen to know what the P generally stands for?
I think I know this one. It is P stands for the probability that this statistical result is through chance. So you want it to be low
Yeah,
to
that's
show that
right.
it's a
That's right.
real
The lower the
correlation.
better. Right. Yeah. So in general, in science, for every statistical result, you have to calculate a p-value, and there are standardized techniques for doing this. And yeah, it tells you the chances that the effect you think you're seeing could be just spurious, which is to say, this isn't you're not actually seeing an important effect, that this result just happened by chance. In science, in most parts of science, there's a specific threshold, which is you get to claim that your result is statistically significant if the p-value is less than 0.05 or less than 5%. In other words, in science, the criteria for everything, but especially for publication, in a scientific journal is you need to be able to claim that if you did the experiment 20 times and there was no real effect, that there's only one chance in 20 that you would have gotten this result purely by accident. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I want to talk about two examples of it may not be fraud, it might be something else, but two examples of results in science which have been the focus of a lot of conversation over the years. And I want to go. One of the examples is going to go all the way back to the beginning of the science of genetics in the middle of the 1800s, and the other example is going to be very recent. And that's actually going to be an example from psychology. But when we get there, you'll see why I think it falls under there's a physicsy aspect to it as well. All right, so let's go all the way back to the middle of the 1800s. There was a well, he was an aspiring academic, but for whatever reason, he never got a professor position at a university. So he was kind of a frustrated academic. And instead, he ended up joining an abbey as a monk. Let's see, in the Czech Republic, and I'm looking for the name of the abbey. It's the St. Thomas Abbey in Brno. And this person's name was Gregor Mendel. Now, Sam, as an outsider, well, did you learn about Gregor Mendel in high school or college?
Absolutely. Yeah,
Oh,
absolutely
okay.
in high school.
Do you remember anything about what he did?
I mean, the peas, right? You
Something
talk
about
about pea
peas.
hacking. He was the
Yes, not.
first pea hacker.
But do you remember what he did with peas or what the point of the peas was?
He's like hybridizing, making the genes, finding out which traits what happened when he combined like different plants with different traits and made
Yeah.
other plants out of them.
Yeah, that's basically it. So I mean, he studied a range of plants, but he discovered fairly early on that peas were especially useful for him. And he studied the trait. He managed to isolate certain traits in peas that he could reproduce from generation to generation, which is to say, he found certain what we would call mutant lines that bred true from generation to generation. One of those traits was the shape of the pea was wrinkled instead of round when you dried it out. One of those traits was the if you dried out the peas, they looked yellowish instead of green. One of the traits had to do with the height of the plants. So there was basically what you, in modern language, we would call a dwarf variety of pea, and so on. And and so he developed a set of lines that bred true from generation to generation. And these are, in modern language, we would say these are were mutant lines of various kinds, and in modern language, we'd say these each have a unique genetic defect. But Mendel was working in the 1850s and 60s, and none of that language existed yet. The word mutant didn't exist. The word gene, I don't think the word gene had been coined yet, and if it had, Mendel never used it. Um, the word, yeah. So, I mean, there were, in Mendel was essentially the founding father of genetics, and his work, he did his experiments over the space of about 10 years, and he published, I think, just one or two big papers that laid out his results at the end of that time. But those papers are by far some of the most important in all of biology. And in particular, I mean, I'll just very briefly explain one of the things he showed. He showed that one of these mutant traits might be present in one generation of plants, but that if he crossed it with, if he, in other words, if he didn't breed it with another of the same kind, that in the second generation, in the second generation of plants, the yellow pea trait would be gone. But then in the third generation of plants, which is, say, if he bred some of those plants, the yellow pea trait could come back. So he showed at one stroke that there were what we would call true breeding mutant lines, that the mutant trait could vanish in one generation and reappear in a second generation, which is to say, the mutant trait could be hidden. And what's that in modern language, we would say the mutant trait could be recessive. But that meant it could come back in later generations. Okay, so Mendel did all of this. And then to top it all off, he also came up with a mathematical rule. He noticed that in that third generation, what you might call I want to call it the grandkid generation, that the mutant trait was always come back only in 1 out of 4 of the grandkids of the plants in that third generation. Okay, so if he was tracking the yellow pea trait in the third generation, only one plant in 3 on average, would have the yellow pea trait. All the other 3 out of 4 would have green peas, although if upon further experiment, some of those green pea plants might also have hidden this yellow pea trait. Okay, so Mendel did all of this, and he did all of it in 10 years. And in just 1 or 2 papers, really an extraordinary achievement for someone who, for some reason, wasn't able to get an academic appointment. Um, and then, uh, and then, and then Mendel. I mean, the thing is, Mendel was working at an abbey, and the abbot, the head of the abbey, passed away, and and Mendel was very well liked, so he was nominated and accepted the position to head the abbey. And at that point, his scientific output almost completely stopped. Okay, so, and Mendel was a popular and successful abbot for the remainder of his life. He passed away about 20 years later in 1884. But the papers themselves were published in 1865, 1866, and almost immediately, the papers, they were in a small journal that very few people read. He sent a couple of copies to famous biologists that he respected, but for the most part, virtually all of his work remained completely unknown for the next 30 years. And so he never lived to see the fact that his work founded an entire discipline, and that he never lived to realize that he would become one of the most famous biologists in history. It's just one of those unfortunate circumstances. Um, and then Mendel's work was rediscovered around 1900. So around 1900, 3 biologists who had begun working on genetics and heredity or hybrid organisms for various reasons, they all independently rediscovered Mendel's papers tucked away in various libraries. And very quickly, people realized not just that Mendel had founded the discipline that they were trying to found, but they realized that his mathematical rules seemed to hold we're correct, and that he should be admired not only for founding the discipline, but also establishing some very foundational rules in that discipline. Um, this is where the story has a bit of a turn. So we're going to talk about some potential flaws in Mendel's research, but I do want to say right at the beginning, this as we talk about the possibility that there were some flaws in his research, I'm not. This should not diminish his accomplishment. He was working mostly in isolation, not at a university, not surrounded by other scientific geniuses. He came up with his own research program. He achieved an extraordinary amount in 10 years, mostly working on his own. So I really, I we're gonna talk about some criticisms of the work, but I really don't want to let this minimize the achievement. Hey, Sam, how are we doing?
I'm doing good.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Um, all right. So at almost as soon as his work was rediscovered, there were biologists who were good at statistics. I mean, I should say Mendel was not, I mean, Mendel didn't have access to the statistics that were available in 1900, but or at a minimum, he certainly wasn't too concerned about it. But in 1900, around 1900, when people revisited his work, Mendel had carefully recorded the numerical side of all of his results. And in particular, this business about the grandkids or the third generation of plants having the recessive trait in the ratio of 1 to 3, which is to say 25% of plants had the yellow peas. But he actually he didn't just say, oh, about 25%. He gave the actual numbers. He said, this is how many plants had yellow peas. This is how many plants had regular green peas. And he did this for all the traits he was tracking. And when biologists began looking at these numbers, they noticed something odd. Okay. And the reason they were able to tell that something was weird, or the reason they thought something was weird, was that it turns out that inheritance of recessive traits is random. So it would be a little bit like so imagine you're flipping a coin, or no, let's imagine you're rolling a die, and that die has four sides. And on one side of that die, it says yellow, and on the other three sides it says green, right? So if you then flip the die 1,000 times, you're not going to get exactly 250 yellow flips and 750 green flips, right? That's not the way it's going to. I mean, you could.
Probably,
What was that, Sam?
probably you're not going to get
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. There's going to be some reasonable distribution. Maybe
Yeah.
you'll see, 235 yellows and the rest green, or maybe you'll see 257 yellows and the rest green. But the point is that with statistical techniques that were available in 1900, people were able to figure out, looking at Mendel's numbers, what are the chances that his dice rolls were the results of pure chance? Let me rephrase. What are the chances that even if there is an effect, what are the chances that his dice rolls were or you should say, what are the chances that his observations were as good as they looked? Right. So in other words, he kept getting very close to 250 yellow out of 1,000 plants, right? So you could ask, well, how close did he keep getting to 250? And the answer is this is what people began realizing. What we now know is he got his results kept being too close to the 250 that he was expecting. Right. So one of the first people to notice this, maybe the first person to notice this, wrote, "He is either a liar or a wonderful man." But by wonderful, that's not the modern use of the word wonderful. That means full of wonder, which is to say miracle man. Right. So in other words, the first person to notice this wrote, "He is either a liar or a miracle man." But it didn't really. People mostly were focused on the results. People reproduced the results. They just, their numbers were a little bit more random than Mendel's were. But then the controversy really started around 1936 when one of the most famous statisticians in the world, someone named Fisher, published a paper analyzing Mendel's results in detail. And he concluded that the likelihood that Mendel was going to get results as good as he did purely by chance were only 1 in 10,000. And so suddenly, well, actually not suddenly, but he was implying that Mendel cheated or something else was very fishy about his results. Um, and actually, just the same way that Mendel's work had been forgotten for 30 years, Fisher's critique was largely forgotten for 30 years. But then around 1964, all right, which is the 100th anniversary of Mendel's conclusions, um, Fisher's objection to Mendel's work was rediscovered, and that spawned an entire subfield of genetics, which was just sort of trying to reanalyze Mendel's work and understand what had happened. There were I would say to date, there's probably been 100 papers written on this, more or less. Mostly, I have to admit, I don't quite understand why so many people spent so much effort on this. Sam, do you have any insight into why so many people would take a stab at trying to understand where Mendel went wrong?
Oh, and it seems very, I mean, he's a famous person. He's in the textbooks, kind of a scientific legend. So I think it
So,
makes sense that people would have a lot of energy focused on it. Like if
hmm,
Darwin or if Newton or Lavoisier or someone like that was being suspected of scientific malpractice, that seems like a pretty
yeah.
big deal.
I mean, the thing is, I mean, on the one hand, maybe he committed scientific malpractice. On the other hand, by 1964, people, two, three generations of biologists had reproduced his results. So, I mean, his conclusions weren't in question. In addition, I don't think he had access to the statistical techniques that were available in the 20th century. So I kind of feel like, I mean, were people, yeah, I guess I am a little confused about the degree to which people were focused on this. Maybe it's not a coincidence that this all got its start in the 1960s. The 1960s was a moment where uh, where people became open to criticizing their heroes in a way that hadn't happened before. Right? It was the counterculture movement. Questioning authority was the very hip. I mean, I think that might have been part of it, but I have to admit, I mean, I actually found out about this controversy in the 1980s when I was still in high school. One of my teachers shared a poem someone had written that was basically just saying that, I mean, I couldn't find the poem, unfortunately, for today, but somewhere in the poem was the line that Mendel got just simply threw away some of the peas that didn't match his expectations. Right. So I think, yeah, I mean, I think partly. Yeah, I mean, I think it might have to do a little bit with trying to defend Mendel as a hero in biology, because if you couldn't come up with a way to explain away the statistical issue, then I mean, I don't know. I mean, maybe this is just a sign of my age, but I kind of feel like scientists are human, and Mendel was working at a time before modern statistical techniques. So,
So
why?
if the data were reproduced by
Yeah.
many different scientists, then it seems like he knew the answer. He was right about the answer. And
Right.
so how do you make that jibe with the fact that he may have been fudging the data?
Well, right, but right, right. And yeah, I don't know. I guess, okay, so in my younger days, I think I would have understood this feeding frenzy. I think in my younger days, I would have said, oh, well, people want science to be above reproach, and people want scientists to be these kind of moral authorities in addition to being intellectual authorities. And I think in the 1960s, that was very acutely felt. Um, but having now had a career in science, and actually in the last episode that we recorded, we talked about some of my own experiences in science. So the very human nature of science, of scientists, it doesn't surprise me anymore. So I think. I mean, the idea that Mendel might have fudged his results a little bit, but still had made an important contribution, that doesn't surprise me anymore. But I mean, I think over time I've just become more cynical.
Yeah. So I guess my question was, how, if you just made up your results, say that I'm a fraudulent scientist practicing today. I'm like, oh, I want to show that there's some correlation and get my article published, and I make something up and I fudge the data.
Okay,
That's not going to be reproduced, right?
correct.
Probably, because
Well,
I'm,
okay, so actually, I
yeah,
mean, arguably, in like it's maybe it's the Silicon Valley ethos of fake it till you make it, right? So, so in modern, I mean, I'm not recommending this, but it wouldn't surprise me if some small fraction of all scientists are so convinced that their theory is correct that maybe that there is always going to be a temptation to bend the results a tiny bit or fiddle with the spreadsheet and get the p-value below zero point zero 0.05 that they need to publish rather than applying for more money and double checking the result and making sure that the
yeah,
p-value really is below zero point zero 0.05. I mean, it's easy to imagine. I
yeah.
mean, scientists are human and they're under the same kinds of pressures as and anyone else in any job. Um,
But
you know,
how did Mendel know what the answer was? Because clearly he
well,
knew what the answer was.
I think he intuited it. I mean, I think that his results were right. I mean, actually, his results were approximately 25% or out of every would have that recessive trait, or the ratio of the yellow peas to the green peas was about 1 to 3. I guess this is a deeper question about Mendel's biological philosophy. He wanted the ratio to be exactly 1 to 3. Now that I think about it, this is actually a more profound comment on Mendel's expectations. Why, if like it's rare for biologists to want an exact numerical result, partly because in biology, exact numerical results are so rare. Um, yeah, I guess so. I mean, nowadays we would say, well, he somehow intuited that it was going to be exactly 1 to 3. But yeah, no,
Hmm.
but he wouldn't have been living in a world that had lots of those kinds of integer ratios.
Right.
Um, I am wondering now, I didn't check this for today. I do know that in chemistry, some of the first hints of the existence of atoms were that some chemical reactions happened in exact integer ratios.
Yeah. I was
And now
just
I'm
wondering
wondering
if there's,
when that was first published. Um, because I wonder whether Mendel read about that and wondered whether exact integer ratios might also be playing a role in biology. Gee, you know what? I'll have to research that
yeah,
when we finish recording. But that's a really
that'd be
interesting
interesting.
question. For some
So
reason,
then,
yeah,
yeah.
go ahead, Sam.
So then, for whatever reason, which I agree is fascinating, he had a disposition to think we're looking for a round number. Okay, the number is close to a third or close to a quarter or something. Then how do you think he actually accomplished that in terms of getting it so exact? If
Oh,
it's,
right. So the question is okay, so what are our options to understand why Mendel's results are, in a sense, better than what you would get if you flipped that four-sided die that we were talking about? Well, so I mean, there are a range of possibilities. One possibility, the most obvious possibility, is that he really did just intentionally fake his numbers. Although actually, I should say we do know that he did the experiments, right? So I think the greenhouse no longer exists, but he definitely did build a greenhouse. I mean, he was a very famously, he was a very careful experimenter to do the experiment that he did, right? So let's unpack the actual quality of the experiment he did. So he had a greenhouse and he would grow his peas, and he had to make sure that his true breeding recessive lines didn't crossbreed with the other peas that were in the greenhouse. Now it so happens that pea flowers have both a male part called the anther and the female part called the stamen, and they're together in the same flower. And it turns out the peas can self-pollinate. So many plants won't self-pollinate, but but the peas that we eat, they can self-pollinate. So one nice thing about using peas as an experimental system is if you have a mutant pea line that makes yellow peas, those pea plants, as long as you keep them well separated from other pea plants, and as long as you keep them away from insects that might get into the flowers, they will self-pollinate, and you'll get a succession of generations that all have the same recessive trait. But what Mendel did to crossbreed his peas was he would go into the flower buds before the anther. He would go into the flower buds before they would mature, one flower bud at a time, mind you. Uh, Remove with, I guess he had tweezers or something, use tweezers to remove the anthers that were producing the pollen in the first place. Take mature anthers from another flower, take a tiny little paintbrush, brush it across the anthers of the pollen he wanted to deposit on the stamen, brush the paintbrush onto the stamen, and then tie a little bag over the flower so that no other pollen could get in. And he
Wow.
did this for every pea pod that he wanted to do and that he wanted to ultimately measure. And if you count up all of his experiments, he or an assistant did this something like 30,000 times over
Wow.
the course of 10 years. Um, I mean, that sounds insane, but 30,000 divided by 10 is 3,000. So, it begins to be, the numbers actually become a little bit more doable. That's, year to year, that's probably less than maybe a month's work per year. But still, the idea is that it was painstaking work. And he also had to come up with those procedures in the first place. And I went on that diversion to point out that someone who was that careful about coming up with an experimental protocol would have been very proud of that experimental protocol and very proud of its results. It seems unlikely to me that someone who had invested that much time and effort into developing an experimental protocol that worked would then make up numbers, thereby invalidating 10 years of hard work and 30,000 crossbred pea pods. You know what I mean? Does that add up for you?
No, I see what you mean. Like, why, if you're going to make the data up, why would you,
Yeah, that's right.
just do
If
the
you're going to make the
experiment any
data
old
up,
way?
why spend 10 years in a greenhouse doing all that backbreaking labor? I
Yeah.
mean, it makes no
Yeah.
sense. Um, so, right. So I have trouble reconciling those two pictures of Mendel as both a scientific genius and a very careful experimenter on the one hand, and yet someone who, having done all that work, was willing to just disregard the numbers that he was getting. The Fisher, the person who first really publicized the problems with the math, he maybe he was being generous, but he said, "Oh, maybe there was an assistant in the lab in the greenhouse who knew that Mendel was really committed to the ratio of 1 to 3. So, and the assistant didn't want to disappoint Mendel. So the Fisher, the person, said, well, maybe Mendel had an overzealous assistant who knew what Mendel wanted, and so didn't tell Mendel that he was fudging the numbers.
Hmm.
I mean, that's a possibility. I don't think there's much evidence for that. And in fact, given Mendel's genius and his attention to detail, I think it's unlikely that he would have trusted this kind of work to assistants if he could avoid it. There are some other possibilities. My two favorites are. It turns out you can go in, you can look at his results, and you can actually crunch the numbers and come up with not just the fact that they're too good for chance. You can actually test out various hypotheses for how Mendel might have specifically changed his protocol to get the results that he did. My two favorites are, let's see, in 1968, a statistician named van der Waarden, he suggested that Mendel's results might make sense if you do let's say you do an experiment in 1860 and you get a ratio that's close to 25% yellow peas, but it's not as close as you want. You feel like it's not convincing. So rather than calling that the final experiment, then in 1861, you do the experiment again and you add those results to the first set. And you see whether now you're as close to 25% as you are kind of hoping. And if you're not, then you do the experiment again in 1862 and you add those p's to the results. And you look at the results, and maybe this time you're as close as you need to be to the 25% that you're looking for. So basically, van der Waerden pointed out that, maybe Mendel maybe this was Mendel's protocol. Maybe Mendel simply would add more and more instances of his experiment until he found a ratio that was satisfactorily close to 25%. Now, in modern science, you're not allowed to do that. In modern science, you have to choose your experimental protocol at the beginning,
Yeah.
and then
Say we're
that is
doing
your
a
experiment.
thousand, n equals 1,000 or something, and that's
Yeah, you
it.
have to decide. Yeah, n equals 1,000, n equals 2,000, whatever. And in fact, and the reason for that is, again, this is an example of what you might call p-hacking. If you keep increasing n until your p drops below 0.05, then in principle, I mean, yeah, it's a very actually this is you're not allowed to do it. It's a
Yeah.
violation of the rules of scientific ethics. But those rules didn't exist when Mendel was doing his work.
Yeah. And especially if, since he was right about the actual ratios, then
Well,
if
I do
you
want to be careful. I
do
mean, I
that.
don't think we were allowed to say that the ends justify the means. Is you
Well,
weren't about to suggest?
that's not what I was saying.
Oh, okay,
I
go
wasn't
ahead,
saying
Sam.
that. I was saying since he was right about the ratios, that means that probabilistically speaking, if he does it long enough, because of the law of large numbers, it's going to tend to get to that ratio that he's looking for.
Oh, interesting.
So,
Yeah, you're
like
right. I
that
think you're right.
methodology wouldn't work if you were like way off. You could just,
No, you're
if you
right. If
kept
he was
increasing
wrong
n, you wouldn't
about,
be there. So it's because he was right that that would work.
yeah, I agree. If he was wrong, then that methodology would have failed. The fact that that might have been his methodology. Um, in modern science, you're not allowed to simply keep expanding n, but so that's one possibility. Um, another possibility. Oh, another possibility, and I mean, is that Mendel only reported his best results, not all of his results. I mean, you're also not allowed to do that. So those are two common examples of what you might call p-hacking, which is to say, only choosing your best results, like if you do an experiment 20 times, and then just by chance, 1 out of 20 of those experiments is going to have a p less than 5%, right? So if you do 20 copies of an experiment,
Yeah.
uh, and then your chances are you're going to get at least one where your results are, that better, p less than 0.05. So
So he
again, you're
was
not allowed to do that. In modern science, you're supposed to report both the successes and the failures.
so he was p hacking and p hacking,
Yeah. So, well, we don't know.
but
We don't know
not
if
p hacking.
Oh, right. PEA, p-hacking. Yes. So the bottom line is we'll never know what he actually did. I think, honestly, I do like the Van der Waerden hypothesis, the idea that he kept adding more p's until the number looked the way he wanted it to look. And I like that one maybe because I think to myself, if I didn't know the rules of statistics, that's probably what I would have done. If I was really sure that the ratio was an integer ratio, and if there were no ethical guidelines or no modern statistics to guide me, that's probably what I would do. I mean, having gone through all the effort to grow those p's, I wouldn't throw the numbers away. I would just keep adding more p's until the ratio looked good to me. So I like to, for myself, my headcanon, my, the way I think of it is I think it's like most likely that this is what Mendel did, that he just kept adding p's until the numbers looked good enough for him to tell other people and for him to feel confident about his results.
Well, maybe we should move on to modern p hacking.
Oh, yeah. Well, we have, okay. Sam, do you want to do call this just a shorter episode? I don't know. Oh, actually, maybe we can keep it short. Okay, so let's make an effort to keep the modern example of p-hacking short. So go ahead and let's go all the way up to 20. Come all the way up now to 2011. There was a scientist whose last name was B-E-M, and he managed to publish a really interesting paper in a psychology journal. So, Sam, I've shared with you the title of this paper and also an excerpt from the summary of this paper. So if you could go ahead and read the title and the summary that I shared with you.
Okay. Uh, this is in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. Feeling the Future: Experimental Evidence for Anomalous Retroactive Influences on Cognition and Affect. The term psi denotes anomalous processes of information or energy transfer that are currently unexplained in terms of known physical or biological mechanisms. Two variants of psi are precognition and premonition of a future event that could not otherwise be anticipated through any known inferential process. This article reports 9 experiments involving more than 1,000 participants that test for retroactive influence by time reversing well-established psychological effects so that the individual's responses are obtained before the putatively causal stimulus events occur. The mean effect size and psi performance across all 9 experiments was 0.22, and all but one of the experiments yielded statistically significant results.
Right. So, Sam, do you want to try to unpack I mean, it's not super well coded, but you want to try to unpack what you think he's claiming here?
Absolutely not. I have no idea what this means.
To
I
be clear,
mean,
this was published in a well-respected peer-reviewed journal. This wasn't some fringe something or other. Basically, he's claiming that information travels, that he did 9 experiments, in 8 of which he found a statistically significant indication that information traveled backwards in time and that his participants were able to gather information from the future. Um, right. So actually, I did dig a little bit into what experiments he actually did. I thought it would be like, if you've ever seen any old movies or documentaries about people trying to look for ESP or some,
oh my
uh,
gosh.
you
Okay.
know,
I was having trouble understanding it because I thought this person was publishing the analysis of the Pea-Hacking phenomenon, not
no,
actually
no,
doing it themselves. And
no,
so I was like, yeah, I was very
this is the
confused.
P-hacking paper.
Oh my gosh. Like it's committing
Well, no, no,
Pea-Hacking,
look, let's be
not
clear. I mean,
analyzing
I
it.
don't think, I mean, I don't, I'm not here to accuse this person of fraud. Um, And I don't think actually I'm not sure anyone is accusing this person of fraud. I mean, there's a gray area, and we can talk. We'll talk in a few minutes about how the scientific community responded to this paper. But basically, this person set up a scientific protocol, conducted a range of experiments, testing whether he worked with the students at his university, tested whether his students showed statistically significant evidence that they could grab information from the future with their minds in a controlled laboratory setting. And he's claiming that in 8 out of 9, he did get a statistically significant result. I mean, that's all he's claiming. And I mean, obviously, it would turn the world of biology and physics on its head because physics tells us that no useful information can ever go backwards in time, and that there's no way to gather information from the future in any kind of useful way, like it's being described in this experiment. In biology, similarly, we know that the human brain, it works on the basic principles established by physics and chemistry. There's nothing special about the human brain as far as we can tell in that sense. So this psychology paper is, if it were true, would be violating everything we think we know about the biophysical basis of how the brain works and everything we think we know about the laws of causality as we understand them in the laws of physics. And nevertheless, the rules for publication in this psychology journal were, well, if your p-value is less than 0.05 and your experimental protocol seems kosher, we will publish it. I mean, that's literally all. I mean, that's how this paper got published. His p-values were less than 0.05. His experimental protocol seemed okay. So the journal found no reason to reject the paper. Yeah, so I do want to be clear. I'm certainly not accusing anyone of fraud, and I don't know that Bem was ever accused of fraud. Nevertheless, obviously, this sparked a lot of criticism. Many scientists pointed out that I mean, actually, I didn't dig into a lot of the criticism. There's one paper that we will talk about, but I assume the criticism was based on the sorts of things I just mentioned. I assume that the criticisms were, you're a psychology journal, regardless of whether his p-values were below 0.05, the only way they would make sense is if everything we think we know about psychology, about the way the brain works, and about the fundamental laws of physics would have to be wrong for this paper to be correct. So you shouldn't be claiming causality is violated in a psychology paper. I mean, that would be the nature of the objection I would levy. Um, and but arguably, remember, the p-value is not, it's not the final arbiter. The p-value just says this is the chance that you got this kind of result by accident. And so, right, so if there were 20 guys, if there were 19 other researchers who were just like Bem, and they did similar sorts of experiments, and those 19 other researchers all got negative results and weren't able to publish anything, it's possible that Bem just got lucky, that he was the 1 in 20 that, statistically speaking, got the low p-value and was able to publish, right? I mean, the way we've set up science to work is it's not set up to screen out every possible chance result. It's just set up to limit that occurrence. And then ideally, people attempt to reproduce the results. And if the result isn't reproducible, then we know that the first outcome happened purely by chance. Still, there is the question. Actually, this is a question that I can ask you. This is a philosophical question. Given the importance of what Bem was claiming, do you think the psychology journal, Sam, should have published this paper? Or would you have published this paper?
Oh, no.
Oh, absolutely not.
No, no, because I mean, think about the evidence. Like you said, the evidence. It's like the whole history of science on the one side, and then like, oh, a p-value below 0.05 on the other. It doesn't add up at all.
Yeah,
Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
yeah, yeah. Okay, yeah. I have to admit, if I mean, there's no reason I would be an editor on a psychology journal, but I think obviously, yeah, I think you're right. I think with that, it's a tough one though, right? I mean, eventually we're going to do an episode where we talk about the theory of continental drift, and uh, you know, and and that's an example where there was no. I mean, the idea that continents can move across the surface of the Earth seemed plainly insane. But does that mean we shouldn't have allowed the person who proposed it to write a book about it? There's a gray area here in science, and I think everyone has to come at it with their
Right.
own. Everyone has to come at it with their own philosophy. Clearly, the editors of this psychology journal decided that attempts to reproduce it would weed out what is clearly a statistical anomaly or statistical error. No, no, neither of those words is right. Um, a result that is just happened by chance. There we go. Anyway, so actually, I think in the interest of keeping our podcast relatively short, I will point out that in that a lot of people got really irritated about this. So I'm looking now at a paper I've also shared, Sam. I've shared this with you as well. I don't know how to pronounce the first author's last name, Kekech, maybe, but I'm looking at a paper here called Raising the Value of Research Studies in Psychological Science by Increasing the Credibility of Research Reports. The Transparent Psi Project. And this was published in 2023 in the Royal Society Open Science Journal. And what this is a response to Bem's paper where they attempted to reproduce all of his results, and they found out that his results in their attempts they did not find p-values below 0.05 for any of them. Okay, so I mean, this is how science is supposed to work. People see a result that they think is wrong, and then they invest a bunch of time and effort to double check it, and they find out that they can't reproduce the result. And then, by the way, in the show notes, I will put links to both these papers for the listener who might be interested. But yeah, so they worked very hard. And but let me just reread that title: "Raising the Value of Research Studies in Psychology by Increasing the Credibility of Research Reports." I think partly they were upset about these authors. It's a very long list: one, two, three. There's about oh boy, there's about 30 different scientists who contributed to this. I think they broke up the various 9 experiments by Bem among different labs, and then they collaborated to make sure. I looked into this a little bit. They actually made videotapes of every single student experiment, so that anyone and it was all publicly available. So because this is not standard. This is not standard. Basically, they weren't just concerned with refuting Bem. They were concerned that when a psychology journal publishes a paper like the Bem paper, that that journal is degrading the public perception of psychology research across the board. And I suppose they're not wrong. There are a lot of false positives in psychology journals. This is something, if you look into the literature on the reproducibility crisis in science, it's it's an issue in biology, it's more of an issue in medicine, and it's potentially catastrophic in psychology. So there's this spectrum where as you go towards psychology, the credibility gets less and less. And so this paper was part of a larger conversation in psychology about how does that field of science do a better job of screening out these false positive results. Anyway, but the point is they did attempt to reproduce the results and they got a negative result. This on its own does not disprove the idea that you could get information from the future, but the fact that the fact that Bem's results were also completely inconsistent with everything we know in physics and biophysics is probably a pretty good indication that his result was a false positive. And I think that's probably where we'll wrap up. Sam, any final thoughts?
Well, no, but it seems to me just it was a lot of effort. And so I wonder if there's some other kind of control where you can reduce the need for so many people to do so much work to address something that maybe could have been avoided earlier in another
Um,
way.
well, scientists talk about this. I mean, I read a paper a while back where a group of statisticians said we should the zero point zero 0.05 threshold is just bad and we shouldn't be using it. But I don't remember that there was an easy solution to throwing away the zero point zero 0.05 threshold. Um, I mean, I could read a little bit more about that for a future episode, but I think philosophically, maybe the zero point zero 0.05 threshold is just something that we have to live with in science. Again, it's not. I've encountered the zero point zero 0.05 limit myself. I wrote a paper in 2020. I was writing it in 2023. It came out in 2024. I had a really nice graph that seemed to show a correlation between two variables. It was really clean. I was very proud of myself. But then I did the analysis, and the p-value was like 0.07, not so it was not less than 0.05. And I didn't have any more data because it was on other people's mouse experiments or something, and there was no more data to access without getting research funds and getting time in a lab and spending 2 years on it. So I wasn't able to publish that correlation, even though if you look at the plot, it looks really clean and elegant. So I've encountered this myself, and
Right. So if you were Mendel, you'd say,
oh
I have it. I think this is it. If I just keep
well,
doing a
right.
little more data.
Because of the plot, I am reasonably sure that that correlation is a real correlation. Um, but the rules of science said that because my statistical test was not below zero point zero 0.05, I'm not a well, I mean, I could publish it, but I wouldn't be able to get it into a journal. I mean, now in science, you can self-publish almost anything, for better or worse. But yeah, so I have encountered this limitation myself.
Well, great. Well, that's a great place to end.
Okay.
Thanks
All right.
so much, and
Yeah,
thanks
yeah,
for
I enjoyed the
listening.
conversation. So I'm Eric, and You're Sam, and we are the Boltzmann brains. Thanks for listening, everyone.